I still remember the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee the night my daughter died. Hospitals all smell the same after midnight, like hope scrubbed too hard from the walls. I was sitting in a plastic chair that squeaked every time I shifted my weight, staring at the slow blink of a monitor that no longer had any purpose. They told me her heart had simply stopped. Complications, they said. Diabetes is unpredictable, they said. Accidents happen. Those words landed on me like snow, soft, quiet, and deadly if you stay under them too long. My daughter, Emily, was careful in the way only someone who's lived with illness since childhood can be. She counted carbs like some people count prayers. She set alarms. She never missed a dose. I raised her that way, not with fear, but with discipline. And that discipline kept her alive for 38 years, until one random Tuesday when it supposedly didn't. Her husband, Mark, collapsed into my arms in the hallway outside the ICU. He shook like a man whose bones had turned to water. He kept saying her name over and over, like repetition could rewind time. People notice those things, the loud grief, the public grief. They mistake it for love. I didn't. Not completely. I hugged him because that's what a father-in-law does when his only child is gone and the world expects you to play your part. At the funeral, Mark gave a eulogy that made strangers cry. He talked about strength, about battles fought quietly, about miracles and heartbreak. He never mentioned insulin, not once. I noticed. I noticed things. Old habits don't die just because you retire. I spent 32 years as an investigator, missing persons, financial crimes, homicide. I retired 5 years ago with a bad knee, a quiet house, and a wife already gone to cancer. When Emily married Mark, I promised myself I'd never bring my old instincts into her home. She deserved peace. I deserved rest. But grief has a way of waking things you thought were buried. The night after the funeral, Mark insisted I stay at their house. Our house, he corrected himself quickly, like the word alone might fall apart. Emily's clothes were still in the closet, her shoes by the door. Her pill organizer sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. I stared at it longer than I should have. Muscle memory kicked in. Patterns, routine, disorder where there shouldn't be any. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Mark was asleep upstairs, I stood alone in the kitchen holding that organizer. Tuesday morning's compartment was empty, just like it should be. But something felt off, the way a room feels wrong when a picture frame has been moved a half-inch to the left. I told myself I was imagining it. Grief makes detectives out of everyone. Over the next few weeks, people stopped calling. That's how it goes. Tragedy has a shelf life. Mark went back to work surprisingly fast. He said he needed the distraction. He said Emily would have wanted that. He also mentioned casually over reheated leftovers that the insurance company had reached out. Just paperwork, he said, just formalities. I nodded. Inside, something cold shifted. Insurance life wasn't my field, but fraud often circled it like vultures. I asked simple questions. How much? When? He answered too smoothly. A large policy, employer-sponsored plus a private one Emily had taken out years ago. He said the words financial security like they were meant to comfort me. They didn't. I went home a few days later. My own house creaked in welcome like it was relieved I'd come back alive. I opened the boxes I hadn't touched since retirement. Old notebooks, case files stripped of names, a laptop I kept for no one in particular. I told myself I was just distracting my mind, but distraction doesn't usually involve timelines and notes. Emily's death certificate listed cause of death as hypoglycemic shock, severe, sudden, rare in someone as controlled as she was. I requested her medical records as her father. That part was easy. The hard part was reading them without shaking. Numbers, times, dosages, one anomaly buried in pages of normalcy, a spike where there shouldn't have been one. Enough to raise an eyebrow, not enough to accuse. I called an old colleague, Tom, under the excuse of catching up. We talked about knees and grandkids. Then I mentioned Emily. His voice softened. I mentioned the insulin. There was a pause, just a second too long. "You think someone tampered with it?" he asked. I said I didn't know. That was true. Knowing comes later. First comes suspicion. Mark started avoiding me after that. Missed calls, short texts. He said grief counseling was helping. He said space was healthy. I agreed out loud. Inside, I marked the change. People withdraw when they're hiding or when they're afraid. Sometimes both. One afternoon, I drove past their house without meaning to. Mark's car wasn't there. I parked across the street and sat for a long time staring at the windows. I wasn't looking for proof. I was looking for permission. Permission to stop being just a grieving father and start being something else again. Emily used to tease me when she was a teenager. She'd say, "Dad, you see monsters everywhere." I'd smile and tell her monsters prefer it that way. They like being invisible. They like when you assume the worst thing that could happen is an accident. That night, sitting alone with the hum of my refrigerator and the weight of her absence pressing into my chest, I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. I wasn't going to accuse. I wasn't going to confront. I was going to listen, watch, wait. That's how you catch people who think they're smarter than you. Mark thought I was finished, a retired old man with a bad knee and too much time. He was right about one thing. I had time and nothing left to lose. I didn't rush anything after that decision. Rushing is how you miss the quiet details, the ones that don't announce themselves. I settled back into a routine that looked like grief from the outside. Morning walks with my bad knee, afternoon naps I didn't really take, long evenings watching the same news programs on mute while my mind wandered elsewhere. Mark stopped checking in entirely, which told me more than any confession ever could. People who are innocent tend to cling. People who aren't tend to disappear. I started by learning everything about Mark that I hadn't bothered to learn before. We think we know the people who marry our children, but most of the time we only know the version they show at holidays. I dug quietly, using public records, old habits, and favors that never expire. His credit history showed a pattern of risk-taking masked as ambition. Short-lived business ventures, loans taken and repaid just barely in time. The kind of man who believed he was always one smart move away from something big. The kind of man who would see insurance money not as blood-stained, but as destiny. I visited Emily's grave on a gray morning when the clouds hung low enough to feel personal. I told her what I was doing. Not because I needed forgiveness, but because I needed clarity. Standing there, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit yet. This wasn't just about justice. It was about not letting her story end as a footnote labeled accident. She deserved truth, even if the truth was ugly. My first real break came by accident, the way they often do. I ran into Mark's sister at a grocery store. She looked startled to see me, then overly kind. We talked about weather, about time passing too fast. Then she said something that made my hand tighten around the shopping cart. She mentioned Mark had been under terrible pressure before Emily died, financial pressure. She said it with sympathy, not suspicion. I asked what kind. She shrugged and said she didn't know details, just that he'd been asking about loans, about selling things, about insurance policies, plural. I thanked her and went home without buying anything. Pressure doesn't make people evil, but it does reveal what they're capable of. I pulled the insurance documents next. As Emily's next of kin, I had standing. The insurances were real, the payout was substantial, and the beneficiary was Mark alone. That in itself was unusual. What was unusual was the timing of the private policy's update. 6 months before Emily died, Mark had accompanied her to the appointment where the beneficiary was changed. I remembered her mentioning it casually at the time. She'd said, "Mark's just helping me be responsible." I'd nodded then. I didn't nod now. I requested the pharmacy records next. That took longer. Paperwork always does. When they arrived, I spread them across my dining table like a map of somewhere I didn't want to go. Refill dates, lot numbers. One refill picked up by Mark instead of Emily, citing convenience. Again, not proof, just another stone added to the pile. The thing about people who commit crimes for money is that they always underestimate patience. They think the danger is immediate, loud, dramatic. They don't expect someone to sit quietly for weeks, months, letting them relax into their own certainty. Mark had started spending again. A newer car, small upgrades, nothing extravagant, but enough to suggest relief. He told people the insurance was still processing. Lies don't always come out as words. Sometimes they come out as purchases. I invited him to dinner one night, just the two of us. I said I missed him. I said the house was too quiet. He hesitated, then agreed. When he arrived, he looked thinner, sharper somehow. Guilt ages people in strange ways. We ate in near silence. Then I asked him how he was sleeping. He said fine, too quickly. I asked if he ever dreamed about Emily. He swallowed and said no. That answer told me everything I needed to know. The innocent are haunted. The guilty are relieved. I didn't confront him, not then. I talked about my retirement instead, about old cases, about mistakes. I let my voice soften when I mentioned criminals who thought they'd planned everything perfectly. I watched his hands. He laughed, but it sounded forced. When he left, he hugged me awkwardly, like a man hugging a stranger. That night, I wrote everything down while it was still fresh. The confirmation I needed came from an unexpected place. A former lab technician I'd helped years ago reached out after hearing about Emily through mutual friends. She offered condolences, then carefully mentioned something odd. A test result that had been questioned internally but dismissed because no one wanted to accuse a grieving husband. My chest tightened. I asked what kind of odd. She wouldn't say over the phone. We met the next day. She didn't give me evidence. She gave me direction, a discrepancy, a chain of custody issue, enough to reopen a door I needed opened. I handed everything to Tom, my old colleague, without commentary. Just facts, dates, copies. He didn't promise anything. He never did. He just nodded, the way men do when they understand gravity. Weeks passed. Mark called me once, drunk, late at night. He cried. He said he felt watched. I told him grief does that. I asked if he believed Emily's death was an accident. I said I believed the truth always comes out. He hung up without saying goodbye. The investigation moved quietly. Officially, it was a review. Unofficially, it was a hunt. Mark started unraveling. He missed work, he snapped at people, he made mistakes. Big ones, the kind that leave paper trails and witnesses. He tried to rush the insurance payout. That alone was enough to freeze it. Desperation makes people sloppy. The day they came for him, I wasn't there. I was at Emily's grave again. I felt no triumph, no relief, just a deep aching sadness that this was how her love story ended. They told me later he confessed when confronted with the evidence. Insurance fraud, tampering, intent. Words that feel clinical until they crush your chest. I went home that evening and sat in the dark. Justice had been served, they said, but justice doesn't bring people back. It just keeps the lie from surviving them. I slept for the first time in months that night, not because I was at peace, but because the truth was no longer alone. I woke the next morning to a silence that felt heavier than grief. The house seemed smaller, somehow, as if the walls themselves were weighing in on me. Justice had been served, they said, but the word felt hollow in my mouth. Emily was gone, and nothing, no amount of cunning or evidence, would bring her back. Yet I couldn't stop myself from replaying the past months in my mind, every tiny clue I had followed, every moment I had doubted myself. I had been quiet, patient, methodical, just like I had been in my career. But now that the hunt was over, I wondered if the weight of watching someone you once trusted so completely had poisoned them, and you, just as much as it had poisoned her. I found myself going through Emily's things, not because I needed to grieve, I already had, but because I needed to remember the life she had built before it was shattered. Her journals were tucked away in a drawer I had never dared to open before. They smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, a scent that reminded me of her childhood bedroom and the way she used to bury her nose in books instead of crying when she was upset. I sat at the edge of the bed and opened the first one. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind that suggested she measured her thoughts before she trusted anyone enough to record them. Page after page, she had written about ordinary things, her work, her friends, her dreams, but scattered throughout were tiny glimpses of unease. A line here about feeling exhausted for no reason, a note there about someone borrowing money, someone she didn't trust completely. I hadn't noticed these signs when I could have, because I was her father, not a detective. I hadn't seen the pattern forming right in front of me. By the time I reached the middle of the journal, my hands were shaking. She had written about Mark, at first affectionately, but later with a coldness I hadn't recognized. "He worries me sometimes," she wrote. "I don't know if I can trust him with everything." There it was. My heart ached, and I felt a pang of guilt for not realizing sooner. I had been so focused on the external signs, the clinical anomalies, that I hadn't considered her own intuition, the one thing that is often the first alarm before numbers and records catch up. I placed the journal down and looked around her room. Her shoes were still by the door, her favorite sweater hung over the chair. I realized in that moment that life after Emily wasn't just quieter, it was unfinished. Her story had been cut off, and I was left to carry the weight of the ending she never asked for. That's when I knew I had to do more than just seek justice legally. I had to preserve her memory, the Emily I knew before she became a victim of greed. I started small. Old photo albums, letters, keepsakes. I cataloged them, writing little notes about when each moment had happened, why it had mattered. My goal wasn't just to remember her, it was to create a record of who she was, a life lived fully, not just the tragedy of her death. It was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated. Grief and memory, after all, are heavy burdens, but I could bear them better than I could bear lies. As I worked, I noticed patterns I hadn't before. Mark had left little traces of himself in her world, things that seemed innocent but were actually clues. Receipts, notes, small transfers of money that didn't make sense. I photographed everything, meticulously, as if I were still chasing criminals on a case. The difference now was that the suspect had already been caught, but the story needed to be told fully, for her, for me, and for anyone who might one day walk in her footsteps. One evening, as the sun was setting, I sat on her bed with her journal in my lap and allowed myself to speak aloud. "Emily," I whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. My voice cracked, and for a moment I imagined her sitting across from me, telling me not to cry, telling me that life sometimes leaves us with unanswered questions. That imagined presence was both comforting and agonizing. I knew I couldn't bring her back, but I could make sure her life and the truth of her death were never forgotten. A few weeks later, I received a call from the insurance investigators. They had closed the case, Mark had been prosecuted, and everything was moving as it should legally. But their words brought me little relief. I thanked them politely and hung up, staring at the wall as the weight of silence settled back in. Legal justice is one thing. Emotional justice is something totally different. Emotional justice is recognizing the harm, honoring the victim, and finding a way to live forward without letting bitterness consume you entirely. I found a small satisfaction in routine: morning walks, tea on the porch, tending to the small garden Emily loved. Her flowers bloomed, defiant against the cold, much like her spirit had always been. I found myself talking to her sometimes, telling her about the mundane events of the day. My own voice became a conduit for her presence, a way to keep her alive in small, quiet ways. People began to notice the change in me. Friends, neighbors, even casual acquaintances. I seemed calmer, more reflective. Perhaps they didn't know that inside I was still processing the betrayal, still haunted by the memory of Mark's false grief. But I had learned a crucial lesson since Emily's death. Patience and observation matter more than anger and haste. Rushing through grief, rushing through revenge, only leads to missed details and regrets. One night, while reviewing her journals again, I stumbled upon a passage I hadn't read before. She had written about forgiveness, not for Mark, not for herself, but for me. "Dad," she wrote, "you don't have to carry the weight of the world. You've done enough. Don't let anger steal your life." Reading those words, I felt an unexpected peace. Emily's wisdom transcended even death. She was teaching me, still guiding me, even though she was gone. I realized then that my mission wasn't just about uncovering the truth or punishing the guilty. It was about ensuring that Emily's life, her essence, remained intact. That meant creating memories, preserving stories, and speaking her name aloud without shame or sorrow. It meant living with her absence, but not being consumed by it. Months passed, and life began to settle into a fragile rhythm. Friends invited me to gatherings. I smiled, not out of pretense, but because I could. I laughed, though the sound was rare and hesitant. Every step forward reminded me that while grief may never fully disappear, it could transform into a quiet resilience, a resilience Emily instilled in me from the moment she was born. Yet even with that resilience, the memories of betrayal lingered. I would never forget the sight of Mark at her funeral, the way he wielded grief as a shield. I would never forget the subtle manipulations, the false kindness, the hidden agenda. But those memories no longer consumed me. They informed me. They reminded me to value honesty, to treasure intuition, to honor truth. I began sharing Emily's story in small ways, not just the crime, not just the tragedy, but her life, the person she was, the daughter, the friend, the woman who loved fiercely and lived fully. I wrote letters, recorded videos, spoke to community groups about the importance of paying attention, of trusting instincts, and of protecting loved ones without letting fear paralyze you. It became a mission of preservation and awareness, a way to transform pain into purpose. And through it all, I realized the truth that carried me through the darkest nights. Some people think age diminishes power, that wisdom is irrelevant in a world obsessed with youth and speed. But experience is a sharper tool than any impulsive strength. Mark had underestimated me because he saw only an old man with a quiet life. He didn't see the years spent reading people, the patience cultivated through decades of observing, the ability to wait and watch without revealing intent. That underestimation was his undoing. In the end, I understood that revenge, while satisfying, was only part of the story. The real victory was in preserving Emily's memory, honoring her instincts, and ensuring that truth endured even when the world had moved on. And in that quiet, deliberate act, I found a kind of peace, a peace I knew Emily would recognize, a peace she had written into her life before the world tried to take it away. Days blended into weeks, and the world around me continued in its relentless motion, oblivious to the quiet storm I had endured. Yet, in the stillness of my own home, I kept building a life that honored Emily's memory, piece by piece. I began keeping a detailed journal myself, not just about her, but about my process of healing. I wrote about grief, about justice, about the delicate balance between patience and action. Writing became a ritual, a conversation I could have with her, even in her absence. One morning, I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was unmarked, simple, with my name written in careful print. I opened it slowly. Inside was a brief note from Mark's sister. She wrote that she had been thinking about Emily, about her life, and about the way things ended. She asked if I would meet her for coffee. Something in her tone suggested remorse, or perhaps fear. Either way, I agreed. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind with faded wooden tables and the smell of roasted beans lingering in the air. She arrived first and was nervous, wringing her hands. When she saw me, her eyes softened. "Thank you for coming," she said. I just wanted to say, I didn't know he was capable of this. I swear, I never thought—" Her voice trailed off, and I nodded. "I understand," I said quietly, "but you need to know that ignorance doesn't undo harm. You can't fix what's been done, but you can choose what you do next." She nodded, swallowing hard. We sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in our own thoughts. Then she asked a question that caught me off guard. Did you hate him?" I thought about it. The truth was complicated. "I hated what he did," I said finally. "Not him, not entirely. Hate is a heavy burden, and I've learned it doesn't bring back the people we lose." She looked relieved, as though expecting fury and finding understanding instead. Our conversation drifted into memories of Emily, her laugh, her stubborn streak, the way she always insisted on baking cookies on rainy days. Speaking about her felt like breathing again, even if the air was bittersweet. By the end of the meeting, I felt a strange weight lift, the kind that comes when you release a part of your anger, carefully, without letting it disappear entirely. Back at home, I returned to the journals, photographs, and letters I had been organizing. I began compiling them into a narrative, a record of Emily's life that was untainted by the darkness that had ended it. It became a labor of love. Every day I carved out hours for it, reading her words aloud to myself as if she were in the room, listening. Sometimes I cried, sometimes I laughed. Each page was a bridge to her, a way to keep her present even as the world moved on. As I worked, I noticed subtle changes in myself. The sharp edge of anger dulled into something more reflective. I could think about Mark without a tremor of immediate fury. I could remember Emily without the overwhelming ache that had consumed me for months. The pain remained, of course, it always would, but it had softened into something bearable, something that allowed me to act instead of merely react. Then came a quiet morning that changed everything again. I received a call from Tom, my old colleague. His voice was low, careful, almost hesitant. He said, "I need to show you something. It's about the investigation." My stomach tightened. I had thought the legal process had wrapped up, that the case was closed, but there were always loose threads, the small details that escaped even the most careful pursuit. He met me at his office, a place cluttered with old case files and the faint smell of coffee. He handed me a folder. Inside were documents and photographs that revealed Mark had been involved in other minor manipulations, things that hadn't risen to the level of prosecution but were patterns nonetheless. Bank transactions, small insurance claims, phone records, nothing explosive, but enough to paint a picture of someone who had learned to exploit trust over time. I studied the documents in silence, the weight of recognition settling over me. "I should have seen it sooner," I murmured, mostly to myself. "I should have protected her better." Tom placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "You did everything you could with the tools you had. Emily would want you to live, not to drown in regret." His words cut through some of the darkness I had been carrying. I nodded, tucking the folder under my arm. Patterns mattered, justice mattered, but life, her life, was what truly needed honoring. Returning home, I sat at Emily's desk, staring at the handwritten pages I had been transcribing. A thought occurred to me that felt both terrifying and necessary. I wanted the world to know her story, to see the life she had lived beyond tragedy, and to understand the warning it carried. I began drafting a memoir, not just of the crime, but of Emily herself, of her spirit, her laughter, her stubbornness, and her heart. I wanted it to feel real, to resonate with anyone who had ever loved and lost, anyone who had ever trusted and been betrayed. The work was consuming. I spent hours each day at the desk, piecing together fragments of Emily's life, weaving them with my own reflections. I included the moments of joy, the quiet victories, the small battles she fought daily with her illness, and the way she carried herself with dignity despite it all. I wrote about Mark carefully, not as a villain in a fairy tale, but as a human who had chosen a path of greed and betrayal. The truth, I realized, was more powerful than embellishment ever could be. Weeks turned to months. The manuscript grew, a testament not just to Emily, but to resilience, vigilance, and the human capacity to honor love even in the face of betrayal. I shared early drafts with Tom, who offered careful guidance and emotional support. I shared sections with a small circle of trusted friends, people who had known Emily and me, to ensure that the story remained authentic. Each time I felt a measure of relief, as if the act of telling her story aloud, albeit quietly at first, was lifting the shadows that had clung to my heart. It was during this period of writing that I realized the extent to which patience had shaped me. Had I acted impulsively, had I allowed grief to blind me, I might have ruined everything. Evidence could be destroyed, truths missed, memories tainted. Instead, I had waited, observed, preserved. Justice had been served, yes, but it was the slow, deliberate work that had ensured it was complete. One evening, I placed Emily's journal beside my manuscript and spoke aloud, softly, almost reverently. "You're safe now, Emily. Your story is safe, and so is the truth." I felt a quiet warmth, the kind that comes from resolution, from knowing that even in the absence of the person you love most, their life, their essence can continue to have meaning. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Grief, love, justice, and truth are threads in the same tapestry. Each binds us to the people we have lost. Each challenges us to act wisely and carefully. Each demands that we remember. Emily's life had been stolen in part, but her story, her spirit, and the lessons she had left behind were mine to carry forward. The following months were quieter than I expected, but not peaceful. Quiet is different from peace. Quiet is the absence of noise. Peace is the absence of chaos inside you. My days became measured and deliberate. Mornings spent tending Emily's garden, afternoons with her journals and my manuscript, evenings with a cup of tea and memories that refused to fade. Yet the shadow of Mark lingered, not in presence, but in the way his betrayal had shaped my days. I realized that letting go entirely wasn't possible, but learning to live with the weight of it and not under it was essential. One afternoon, I received a message from a local community center. They had heard about Emily's story and wanted me to speak to a small group about vigilance, trust, and the importance of paying attention to the people you love. I hesitated at first. Public speaking had never been my forte, and recounting the events that had destroyed my family felt like reopening a wound. But I agreed, knowing that her story could prevent someone else from enduring the same pain. The day of the talk, I walked into the modest hall, lined with folding chairs and a scattering of familiar faces, neighbors, friends, even a few strangers who had heard through word of mouth. I carried Emily's journal with me, letting its weight remind me of why I was there. When I began to speak, I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told them about my daughter, about her life, her care, her laughter, and the vigilance she had practiced every day to live fully with her illness. I spoke about Mark cautiously, framing his actions not as villainy in a storybook sense, but as a real warning about human greed and deceit. I noticed something remarkable as I spoke. The listeners leaned in, silently, absorbing the narrative. They weren't merely hearing a cautionary tale. They were witnessing grief, lived and endured, transformed into purpose. I spoke about patience, about observation, about the subtle signs we often ignore in those closest to us. I spoke about the importance of intuition and trusting the instincts that so often go unheard. When I finished, there was a long pause, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of understanding. Then, slowly, people began to clap. Not for me, but for Emily, for her life, and for the truth we had preserved. Afterward, several people approached me, sharing their own experiences of loss, betrayal, and near misses with deception. Some thanked me for the courage to speak. Others asked questions about vigilance and protection, about how to notice the quiet signs before it's too late. Each interaction reminded me that Emily's story had ripples far beyond our family, that even tragedy could teach, guide, and inspire if we allowed it. One evening, I returned home and found a letter slipped under my door. It was unsigned, written in a neat hand. It read simply, "Your patience and care saved more than her story. It saved you, too." A friend. I didn't know who had left it, but I didn't need to. The words resonated, a quiet acknowledgement that even in solitude, we are sometimes witnessed, sometimes understood. I also began to notice changes within myself that surprised me. The anger I had carried for months had softened, not vanished, but shifted. It became a lens through which I could view the world more clearly, not a weight that pinned me down. I could remember Mark's betrayal without the immediate sting of rage. I could reflect on Emily's death and feel sorrow without losing myself entirely. And most importantly, I could look at my own role, not with blame, but with acceptance. I had done everything I could with the knowledge, tools, and instincts I possessed at the time. That realization was liberating. In the garden, the flowers Emily had planted began to bloom anew. I tended them as she would have, talking to them as if she were there, describing my day, sharing memories, expressing hope that the garden would flourish even without her hands to guide it. It was a small act, but in it I found a kind of continuity, a way to honor her presence in the tangible world. One particularly quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the sky bled soft shades of orange and purple, I picked up my manuscript again. I read through the sections I had written, polishing language, adjusting pacing, making sure Emily's voice, the one I had carried in my memory, remained clear and uncorrupted by grief. Her spirit, I realized, could inhabit these pages more fully than it had in her absence, and in giving her that voice, I felt a sense of completion that had eluded me since her death. Around that time, Mark's case reached the appellate stage. I followed it quietly, not out of obsession, but to ensure that justice continued to hold its place. He had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and tampering, but minor appeals and procedural reviews were inevitable. I didn't attend court. I didn't need to. The truth had already been recorded, both legally and in Emily's preserved story. The legal machinery was now simply formalizing what had been evident from the start. He had underestimated me, underestimated patience, underestimated the enduring power of truth. Sometimes, late at night, I would find myself speaking aloud to Emily as if she were beside me. "They underestimated you too, Dad," I would whisper, remembering her courage in facing illness, her diligence in caring for herself, and her quiet, steadfast morality. In those moments, grief felt less like a chain and more like a companion, guiding me toward purpose, reminding me that love endures even in absence. The manuscript grew steadily. I began considering ways to share it with the public, whether through publication or reading sessions. I wanted people to understand that vigilance and love were not contradictory, that patience could be a form of strength, and that honoring those we lost was as much about living well as it was about remembering. It was a story about crime, yes, but more than that, it was about human resilience, morality, and the choices we make when faced with betrayal. In reflecting on the months since Emily's death, I understood something fundamental. Revenge is not the end point. Patience, observation, preservation of truth, and honoring memory, those are the acts that endure. Revenge may offer temporary satisfaction, but it does not create continuity. It does not preserve the life, spirit, and lessons of those who have been taken from us. By choosing deliberate action, I had ensured that Emily's life mattered in ways that outlasted the crime itself. And I also realized the broader truth about underestimation. Mark's fatal error was not merely his greed, but his assumption that age and apparent vulnerability equated to weakness. He failed to recognize the quiet power of experience, the discipline cultivated over decades, and the deep, enduring love of a father willing to see beyond grief to truth. That lesson, painful as it was, became part of my own narrative, a cautionary reminder that wisdom and observation often wield more power than impulse and deceit. By the time spring returned, the garden was alive with color. The roses Emily had planted bloomed with vigor, the tulips stood tall, and even the small patch of wildflowers she loved had begun to spread beyond its borders. Sitting among them, notebook in hand, I reflected on how life persists even after profound loss. There is a rhythm to it, subtle and patient, reminding us that memory and love can coexist with grief, and that even in absence, the living carry the essence of those who have passed. In the end, I came to understand that my journey had been as much about my own healing as it had been about justice for Emily. Every step, every patient observation, every careful record, every moment spent reflecting and remembering had led to a profound clarity. The truth had prevailed, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was meticulously preserved, quietly nurtured, and deeply honored. And as I closed the notebook, watching the sunlight filter through the trees Emily had planted, I whispered, "We did it, Emily. Your story lives." In that moment, I felt a stillness that was not sorrowful, but full of remembrance, purpose, and the enduring presence of a life that, though stolen too soon, had left an indelible mark on mine. Spring turned into summer, and with it came a new rhythm of life that felt almost ordinary, yet carried the weight of what had happened. I still rose early, tended the garden, and read through Emily's journals, but there was a subtle shift in me, a quiet confidence born of having faced betrayal, grief, and the complexity of justice. Life had resumed, not as it was before, but as it needed to be. The house no longer felt like a hollow echo of loss. It carried warmth again, small reminders of Emily in every corner. One afternoon, I received a call from a young woman named Claire. She introduced herself as a journalist working on stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. She had heard about Emily and wanted to understand her story, not as a sensational crime, but as a human experience, a narrative of love, vigilance, and resilience. I hesitated at first. Sharing the story publicly meant exposing painful memories, reopening wounds I had fought to quiet. But I realized that Emily's story could serve as more than caution. It could teach empathy, awareness, and the quiet strength it takes to endure. I agreed to meet her. We met at a small cafe near the park where Emily and I had once spent lazy Sunday afternoons. Claire had a notebook and a gentle demeanor, the kind that made people open up without pressure. I began cautiously, recounting Emily's life, her habits, her laughter, the ordinary details that made her extraordinary. Then I spoke about the subtle signs I had noticed before her death, the anomalies in her medical care, and the patience it took to uncover the truth. I spoke not with triumph, but with reflection. Claire listened intently, occasionally jotting notes, her eyes not just recording facts, but absorbing emotion. She asked questions about fear, about trust, about grief. I answered honestly, realizing that speaking aloud the details I had lived privately for months was both therapeutic and illuminating. By the time we finished, I felt a strange relief, as if articulating Emily's story to someone who truly cared had lifted part of the burden I had been carrying alone. Returning home, I found a letter from Tom waiting for me. He had compiled all the investigative notes and evidence in a digital archive, making it easy for me to preserve Emily's story alongside proof of Mark's actions. He wrote that this archive would not only help protect the facts legally, but could serve as a record for Emily's family, friends, and anyone seeking to understand the importance of vigilance in a world where betrayal can hide behind familiarity. I felt gratitude and quiet reassurance, knowing that even after justice had been served in court, the truth remained secured. In the following weeks, I focused on turning Emily's journals and my reflections into a cohesive narrative. It wasn't an easy task. Grief and memory rarely align neatly. I spent long evenings editing, revising, and ensuring that her voice remained authentic amidst my own interpretation. I was careful to highlight her courage, her intelligence, and her enduring optimism so that the story would not be remembered solely for the tragedy of her death, but for the fullness of her life. During this time, I noticed that my own perspective on justice and patience had deepened. Mark's downfall had come not from confrontation, not from impulsive action, but from careful observation, evidence gathering, and an unyielding commitment to truth. Watching someone underestimate you because of age or outward appearances is a humbling experience, but it is also empowering when you recognize that your accumulated wisdom and restraint can guide the outcome far more effectively than haste. I realized that this was a lesson Emily had left me in more ways than one, the importance of careful thought, of perseverance, and of choosing when and how to act. Summer deepened, and with it came the community events and small gatherings I had begun attending again. I realized I was no longer hiding in grief, no longer retreating into shadows. People saw me as composed, reflective, perhaps even serene. But beneath that exterior was the layered experience of someone who had confronted deception, survived loss, and emerged with purpose. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The work I had done for Emily was enough. Yet I remained vigilant, because lessons learned in betrayal are lessons carried forever. One evening, while reviewing notes for Emily's narrative, I received a message from Mark's lawyer. The appeal had been dismissed, and the conviction was now final. There was nothing more to be done legally. I sat in the dim light of my study, feeling a mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also melancholy. Justice had been served, but the human cost remained. Emily was gone, her life stolen, and no procedural closure could replace her presence. I allowed myself to feel the full weight of that reality, and then I reminded myself of the other truth. I had preserved her memory, her essence, and her story. That, in itself, was a form of enduring justice. I began sharing excerpts of Emily's story with small audiences, carefully curated groups who could understand and appreciate the nuances of her life and the lessons embedded within it. I spoke about vigilance, trust, grief, patience, and the subtleties of human behavior. People responded not with pity, but with introspection, often sharing their own stories of subtle betrayals, overlooked warnings, or loved ones lost. It became a quiet movement, not loud or sensational, but meaningful, a way to honor Emily and ensure her story contributed to the awareness of others. The garden flourished under my care. Flowers she had planted continued to bloom, their colors vibrant and resilient. I often found myself speaking to them, recounting Emily's habits, the way she organized her days, her laughter that could light a room, and the stubbornness that had defined her character. In tending to the garden, I found a tangible connection to her presence, a living reminder that even in absence, growth and beauty persist. During one particularly warm afternoon, I sat with a cup of tea, reviewing the latest draft of the narrative. I paused on a passage where I described the subtle signs I had noticed, the anomalies in her medication, the inconsistencies in Mark's behavior. I realized that this story was not just a chronicle of events, but also a guide, a testament to the importance of attention, patience, and intuition. It was a story that could save lives, alerting others to dangers hidden behind familiar faces. The weight of responsibility settled on me, but it was a weight I carried willingly, as part of the legacy Emily had entrusted to me. I often reflected on the months following her death. The path I had taken, careful observation, patient evidence gathering, deliberate action, had not only uncovered the truth, but had preserved Emily's story in its fullest form. I realized that patience is not passivity, it is an active, intentional engagement with reality, a commitment to let time reveal what hasty action cannot. In this reflection, I found a measure of peace, knowing that I had honored Emily's life and ensured that her voice, even after death, would continue to resonate. As summer drew to a close, I began planning a small publication of the narrative, not a sensationalized account of crime, but a human story about Emily, about trust, about resilience, about the quiet power of observation. I wanted readers to understand the stakes of vigilance, the importance of listening to instincts, and the enduring impact of love and care. I wanted Emily's story to serve as a reminder that truth and memory can endure, even in the face of deception and loss. And so I continued my quiet work, day by day, page by page, garden by garden, memory by memory. The shadows of betrayal remained, but they no longer dictated my life. The echoes of grief persisted, but they were now tempered by purpose and understanding. Emily's presence, though absent in flesh, was alive in every word I wrote, every flower I tended, every reflection I shared. And in that continuity, I found a profound truth. Even when life takes away those we love, it also grants us the responsibility and the power to keep their essence alive, to honor their story, and to transform our grief into enduring purpose. Autumn arrived quietly, draping the neighborhood in shades of amber and gold. The garden Emily had tended was beginning to slow, the vibrant blooms replaced with the crisp beauty of fallen leaves. I found comfort in the changing seasons. They reminded me that life moves forward even when grief feels permanent. Sitting on the porch one afternoon, I sipped tea and watched the wind scatter leaves across the yard. Emily would have loved the colors, the way the light caught on the edges of the trees, and I allowed myself to imagine her laughter carried in the breeze. The manuscript had grown longer than I anticipated. Every detail mattered: her routines, her laughter, the quiet vigilance she had maintained over her own health. I included the lessons I had learned after her death, the importance of patience, the subtle signs that indicate deceit, the necessity of trusting one's instincts. It was not just a tribute to Emily, but also a guide for others. I imagined someone reading it, learning to see the world with sharper eyes, to notice what others might overlook, and perhaps to protect those they loved before it was too late. One evening, I was contacted by a local community outreach program. They were creating a series of seminars focused on elder vigilance and safety, targeting families and caregivers, and they wanted me to speak about Emily's story. I hesitated. My private grief had already been shared with a small audience, but I recognized the opportunity to make a real difference. Emily's life and the betrayal that had taken us from us could serve as a powerful lesson for others. I agreed, knowing that sharing our pain responsibly can transform tragedy into guidance. Preparation for the seminar was intense. I reviewed every note, every journal entry, every investigative document I had collected. I wanted to present a story that was authentic, emotionally charged, and practical. I rehearsed speaking aloud, imagining the audience, practicing pauses to allow key points to sink in. Emily had always valued clarity and precision, and I wanted her voice to resonate through my words. The day of the seminar arrived. I entered a modest auditorium filled with attentive faces, parents, grandparents, caregivers. As I began to speak, I told Emily's story with honesty, never shying away from the betrayal that had taken her to death, but always grounding the narrative in her life, her choices, and her courage. I spoke about Mark's deception carefully, emphasizing not just the crime itself, but the lessons embedded in it, how subtle manipulation can be masked by grief and charm, how patience and vigilance can uncover truth, and how trust must be balanced with awareness. As I spoke, I noticed faces shifting, eyes widening, heads nodding, hands clutched to chests. People were absorbing more than facts. They were feeling the weight of betrayal, the pain of grief, and the quiet power of resilience. I shared practical advice drawn from my experience, documenting routines, observing inconsistencies, maintaining records, and above all, trusting intuition. I emphasized that vigilance is not paranoia, it is care, protection, and love made deliberate. Afterwards, several people approached me individually. Some shared stories of lost family members, unexplained deaths, or suspicious behavior by someone they had trusted. Others asked how to cultivate awareness without losing compassion. Each interaction reinforced the importance of what I was doing. Emily's story had moved beyond personal tragedy. It was now a tool, a lesson, a guide. I realized that her life, though cut short, was continuing to have impact in ways I could not have predicted. Returning home that evening, I found myself thinking not just about Emily, but about the broader lessons her story contained. Betrayal can come from those we love most. Patience can be more powerful than action. Observing quietly, acting thoughtfully, and documenting carefully can be the difference between protection and tragedy. I realized that these lessons applied not just to family, but to life itself. We are all vulnerable in moments of trust, but we also carry the tools to navigate those vulnerabilities if we remain aware. In the following weeks, I continued refining the manuscript. Each page felt like a conversation with Emily, a way to keep her voice alive while sharing the story with the world. I included her favorite recipes, the little rituals she practiced daily, and her reflections on living with diabetes responsibly. It was not simply a memoir, it was a portrait of a life fully lived, with every joy and struggle preserved. I wanted readers to see her as she was, meticulous, loving, strong, and resilient, not merely a victim of tragedy. One afternoon, I received a letter from a distant cousin of Emily's. She wrote that she had been inspired by our story and wanted to meet, to understand more about Emily, and perhaps to contribute to preserving her memory. I agreed, and we met at a quiet cafe, sharing photographs, stories, and reflections. Each story added layers to the portrait of Emily, reinforcing the truth that a life, no matter how abruptly ended, leaves ripples that extend far beyond immediate loss. As autumn gave way to winter, the house felt different. The shadows of betrayal were still present, but they no longer dominated my thoughts. The grief had softened into a reflective sadness, a companion rather than a tormentor. I realized that healing is not linear. It is composed of small steps, moments of clarity, and acts of remembrance. Emily's presence remained vivid, not because the pain was unbearable, but because her life was meaningful, intentional, and worth honoring. One particularly cold evening, I sat by the fire with Emily's journals open. I read passages aloud, speaking them as if she were beside me. The warmth of the fire mirrored the warmth of memory, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine her sitting across from me, smiling, correcting my pronunciation of a word, teasing me about my old habits. It was a bittersweet comfort, but it reminded me that memory, carefully nurtured, can become a living presence in ways that grief alone cannot. In my reflections, I also considered Mark, not with hatred, but with clarity. He had underestimated me, underestimated patience, underestimated experience. That underestimation had been his undoing. Justice had been served, legally and morally, and I had ensured that the truth remained intact. Yet I did not dwell on revenge, because the real victory lay not in his downfall, but in the preservation of Emily's life and the lessons her story contained. I began to understand the broader moral of all this, that vigilance, patience, and deliberate action are forms of care and love, that observing quietly, acting thoughtfully, and documenting carefully can protect those we love in ways impulsive emotion cannot, that grief, while inevitable, can be transformed into purpose when paired with reflection and commitment. Emily's life had been a testament to these truths, and in preserving her story, I was honoring her legacy and ensuring that others could learn from it. By winter, the manuscript was nearly complete. I had woven together Emily's words, my reflections, the lessons learned from betrayal, and the insights gained through patience and observation. It was both a tribute and a guide, a story of love, loss, resilience, and justice. I read through it one final time, aloud, hearing Emily's voice in every carefully chosen word. In that reading, I felt a profound sense of closure, not because the loss was gone, but because the life and lessons of Emily were secure, enduring, and shared with the world. And in the quiet of that winter evening, I realized something vital. Life may take the ones we love too soon, and betrayal may strike from those we trust most, but truth, patience, vigilance, and love can endure. They can preserve memory, teach lessons, and transform grief into purpose. Emily's life had been a testament to these truths, and in preserving her story, I was honoring her legacy and ensuring that others could learn from it. Winter deepened, wrapping the world in a quiet stillness that matched the rhythm I had come to inhabit. The garden lay dormant under frost, but inside the house, Emily's presence felt more alive than ever. I spent long hours by the window, notebook in hand, reflecting on the journey that had begun with grief, suspicion, and betrayal. Every detail of those months came back vividly: the shock of learning her death was no accident, the careful collection of evidence, the slow unraveling of Mark's lies, and the patient navigation of grief into purpose. Each memory reminded me how fragile life is, how easily trust can be broken, and how crucial it is to honor those we love by preserving truth. One evening, a knock at the door startled me. I opened it to find Claire, the journalist, standing there with a small notebook and a determined expression. "I wanted to check in," she said, smiling faintly. "Your story, it's unlike anything I've encountered. It's about more than crime. It's about life, vigilance, and love." I invited her in, and we sat by the fire, speaking quietly. She had compiled preliminary notes for an article she planned to pitch, and she wanted my approval before anything went public. I appreciated her thoroughness and her respect for Emily's memory. Together, we reviewed her draft, making minor adjustments, emphasizing Emily's courage, the lessons I had learned, and the importance of vigilance without paranoia. After she left, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. Sharing Emily's story publicly meant it could touch lives, but it also meant exposing the raw truth to the world. I reminded myself why I had agreed, because her life, though tragically cut short, contained lessons worth preserving, guidance worth offering, and a legacy worth sharing. In the following weeks, I began to receive letters from people inspired by the story. Some were strangers, others were distant relatives or friends of friends. Each letter recounted experiences of near trust betrayed, loved ones endangered, or lessons learned too late. I read them all carefully, taking notes and responding where I could. Each connection reinforced the idea that vigilance is not a burden, but a form of love. Each connection reminded me that Emily's life could continue to impact others, even beyond my own family. Around this time, I received an unexpected visitor, Mark's mother. She was an older woman, frail in appearance, but her eyes were sharp and questioning. She had come to speak with me about her son, to understand what had happened, and perhaps to seek closure. I greeted her cautiously, aware of the potential for confrontation, but I also recognized her grief. We sat in the living room, the fire crackling softly between us, and she asked the questions I had anticipated about Mark, about Emily, and about the investigation. I answered honestly, calmly, recounting the facts without embellishment or emotion. She listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes silent, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "I never imagined he could do something like this," she said. "I always thought he was capable, but not like this." I nodded, understanding more than she realized. "People can surprise us, both in kindness and cruelty," I said gently. "The important thing is to learn from it and to ensure the truth is preserved." She left that evening quietly, a mixture of sorrow and acceptance in her expression. It was a reminder that even those closest to the guilty are not always aware, and that truth often has consequences far beyond the immediate crime. As winter gave way to early spring, I focused on finalizing the manuscript. Each chapter was carefully revised, ensuring that Emily's voice remained intact and that the lessons of vigilance, patience, and love were clear. I included practical advice for families, caregivers, and anyone navigating relationships where trust is essential. I wanted readers to feel Emily's presence, to learn from her life, and to understand that even when tragedy strikes, memory and truth can endure. During this process, I reflected on my own transformation. I had begun these months consumed with grief and rage, driven by a desire for justice and a need to protect Emily's memory. But over time, those feelings had evolved. Grief became reflection, rage became careful observation, and the pursuit of justice became a pursuit of purpose. I realized that the lessons I had learned, patience, vigilance, and deliberate action, were as much for me as they were for others. They had reshaped my understanding of life, loss, and human behavior. One afternoon, while reviewing the final chapters, I noticed a pattern I had overlooked before. Subtle details about Emily's daily life, small habits, and consistent routines were not just a testament to her character, they were evidence of her strength, her ability to navigate life despite her illness, and her resilience in the face of subtle threats. Mark had underestimated her, assuming she would be passive or unaware, but she was careful, observant, and responsible until the very end. Preserving those details became a central goal of the manuscript, ensuring that her intelligence and courage were recognized, not overshadowed by the tragedy. As I finalized the work, I also began planning small ways to honor Emily's memory publicly, not through grand gestures or spectacle, but through community engagement, awareness programs, and sharing her story in educational contexts. I wanted people to learn from her life, to understand that vigilance is an act of love, and that even ordinary people can make extraordinary choices to protect themselves and others. The day I completed the manuscript, I sat quietly by the window, watching the first crocuses push through the thawing earth. I placed Emily's journal beside the manuscript and whispered, "We did it, Emily. Your life, your voice, your lessons, they're safe." A sense of closure settled over me, not because the loss was gone, but because I had ensured that her story would endure. That evening, I reflected on the journey from grief to purpose, from betrayal to justice, from silence to voice. I understood that life's challenges, loss, deception, betrayal, are not obstacles to overcome alone, but lessons to integrate into our understanding of the world. Emily's death had been devastating, but it had also revealed the depth of human resilience, the power of patience, and the enduring significance of truth. I realized, too, that the past we carry, the experiences and skills honed over decades, can never be dismissed. Mark had assumed age and quiet strength were weakness, but in reality, they had been my greatest assets. Experience, observation, and patience allowed me to uncover the truth, protect Emily's legacy, and ensure that justice, though delayed, was complete. In the quiet of that night, I felt a profound sense of purpose. Emily's story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to anyone willing to learn, to observe, and to honor those they love. The manuscript, the journals, and the memories were a gift I could offer to the world, ensuring that even in absence, her life continued to teach, inspire, and guide. And as I sat there, the fire crackling softly, I understood the final lesson Emily had left me, that grief, love, vigilance, and truth are intertwined, that the past we carry, even when we think we have nothing left, equips us, that patience, observation, and deliberate action can turn tragedy into legacy, and most importantly, that even in loss, life can carry meaning, purpose, and the enduring presence of those we hold most dear. Spring had fully arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal that felt almost impossible after the months of grief and investigation. The garden was alive again, bursting with color, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house felt like home instead of a shrine to loss. Sitting on the porch, I could see Emily's favorite flowers swaying in the breeze, their delicate petals resilient against the wind. They were living proof that life continues, even after pain, even after betrayal. I whispered her name aloud, as I often did, and for a moment I felt her presence in the soft rustle of leaves, in the warmth of the sunlight on my skin. By now, the manuscript was complete. It contained everything I had learned, observed, and felt. Emily's life, her courage, her routines, and the subtle ways she had protected herself even as danger lurked close. It also contained my reflections, the months of patient observation, the careful collection of evidence, the quiet planning that had ensured Mark's deceit was exposed. It was a story of loss, yes, but also of resilience, vigilance, and the enduring power of truth. I had read and reread it countless times, each reading a conversation with Emily, each word a bridge to her spirit. The decision to share it publicly weighed heavily on me. I had spent months protecting Emily's privacy and honoring her memory, and now her story was about to become part of the world. But I reminded myself of the purpose, not to sensationalize her death, not to seek attention, but to provide guidance, awareness, and above all, a preservation of her life. If her story could save even one person from betrayal, if it could teach even one family the importance of vigilance, then the risk of exposure was worth it. The day the story was published in its first public form, a serialized article with accompanying reflections, was surreal. I watched as readers from around the country responded, some with gratitude, some with their own stories of lost loved ones or near betrayals. Their words were heartfelt and emotional, a mix of sorrow and recognition. For the first time, I realized that Emily's influence had extended beyond our small circle. Her life, though tragically cut short, was leaving ripples that touched strangers, teaching lessons that might prevent tragedy elsewhere. One afternoon, I received a call from a woman named Laura, a mother whose daughter had been struggling with medical care oversight. She told me that Emily's story had helped her recognize inconsistencies in her own daughter's treatment, prompting her to take action before anything irreparable occurred. I listened quietly, holding back tears as she described the subtle signs she had missed and how the guidance drawn from our story had given her clarity and confidence. "Thank you," she said finally. "Your story may have saved my daughter." I hung up and sat in silence for a long while, realizing that purpose often comes in quiet, unforeseen ways. As the weeks passed, the local news began to cover the story, framing it not as a sensational crime, but as a cautionary tale and a tribute to vigilance. Emily's life, once overshadowed by betrayal and tragedy, became a beacon of awareness and resilience. People reached out, sharing stories of their own experiences with subtle manipulation, illness, and the challenges of trust. I responded when I could, offering guidance, listening, and sharing reflections from the months that had followed Emily's death. I realized that our grief had transformed into community knowledge, a legacy far more powerful than revenge or anger could ever be. I also began receiving letters from those who had faced betrayal in their own families. Some were subtle, almost invisible, but damaging nonetheless. Others were more extreme, echoing the very circumstances that had led to Emily's death. I offered advice, shared experiences, and emphasized the lessons I had learned: to observe carefully, document diligently, and act deliberately. I spoke about patience, about trusting instincts, and about the quiet power of experience. Each interaction reminded me that Emily's story was not merely a tale of loss, but a guide for living with awareness and love. One evening, I walked through the garden, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I remembered the shock of discovering Emily's insulin had been tampered with, the slow, painstaking investigation, the evidence carefully gathered, the confrontations that never needed to happen because patience had done the work of justice. I thought about Mark, how he had underestimated me, how he had assumed age and quiet strength meant weakness, and I smiled faintly, knowing that underestimation had been his undoing. Experience, observation, and deliberate action had triumphed where arrogance and greed had failed. Sitting by the window that night, I reflected on the lessons Emily had left behind. Betrayal can strike from those we trust most, and grief can be overwhelming, but truth endures when nurtured with patience. Love can persist even in absence, and vigilance, far from cold or paranoid, is an act of care. Every step I had taken, from observing anomalies to preserving her story, from careful planning to sharing lessons with others, had been guided by these principles. Emily's life and her death had taught me that purpose can emerge from pain if we allow it. As winter thawed into spring once more, I realized I had been given a gift, the chance to transform tragedy into legacy. The manuscript, Emily's journals, the letters from strangers, the seminar I had given, the stories shared in the community, they were all threads in a tapestry of remembrance and guidance. I could not bring Emily back, but I could ensure that her life, her choices, and her lessons endured. That, I decided, was the true justice I had sought all along. On a quiet morning, I sat at Emily's desk with her journal open beside mine. I wrote a letter to Emily, not as a record for anyone else, but as a final conversation between a father and a daughter he had loved more than words could capture. "Emily," I wrote, "you taught me patience, vigilance, and the enduring power of love. You taught me that even in loss we can find purpose, and even in grief we can find meaning. I will carry your lessons, your memory, and your spirit with me always." Closing the journal, I felt a sense of completion that had eluded me for months, not because the loss was gone, but because her story was secure, her life honored, and the lessons she lived and died for were now part of the world. I realized then that true justice is not always about punishment. It's about preservation, truth, and ensuring that the lives taken or harmed leave an enduring impact. The days that followed were quiet, reflective, and full of subtle joy. I walked in the garden, tended flowers, read letters, and prepared for future seminars and talks. Emily's presence was everywhere, in the wind, in the flowers, in the words I wrote, and in the lives her story began to touch. I had learned, painfully and profoundly, that the past equips us for the present, that patience can be more powerful than action, and that love and vigilance, when combined, can create a lasting legacy. And as the sun set one evening, casting a golden light over the garden,
I whispered to Emily one final time, "We did it, my girl. Your story lives, your life matters, and in every person it touches, your spirit will endure." For the first time in many months, the weight of grief was not overwhelming. It had transformed into purpose, remembrance, and a quiet, enduring peace. I knew that whatever the future held, Emily's lessons would remain, guiding me, guiding others, and ensuring that even in absence, love and truth prevail. The world moves on, as it always does, but some stories leave imprints too deep to fade. Emily's story, our story, had become one of those imprints, a testament to resilience, vigilance, love, and the quiet power of truth. And in honoring her memory, I had discovered a strength within myself I never knew existed, a strength born not of anger, but of patience, not of impulsive action, but of deliberate care, not of fear, but of love that endures beyond presence.
The story ends here, not with despair, but with a quiet resolve that life, even after betrayal and loss, can be meaningful, purposeful, and guided by the lessons left to us by those we love. Emily's voice remains, not just on the pages, but in the lives she continues to touch and in the heart of a father who refused to let her memory fade.